Okay, hello, welcome to our next chapter on speech audiometry. So speech audiometry is a standard part of the audiological test battery. It is essential, it's always done. It happens after pure tone audiometry. So if you remember, pure tone audiometry is tested with air conduction and bone conduction, and it helps us determine the type and the degree and the severity of the hearing loss. Now, audiologists are most concerned not necessarily with beeps and how well a person can hear a beep, but how well they can hear speech. So we do speech audiometry, we do speech testing after we've determined the pure tone thresholds and the type and the degree of hearing loss. Okay, so like I said, the pure tone audiogram can't necessarily determine the degree of disability of the speech impairment, and it is the speech impairment or difficulties hearing speech that is the number one complaint. So the number one complaint of people with presbycusis or sensorineural hearing loss, age-related hearing loss, is that they can hear speech but they can't understand it. So people that have sensorineural hearing loss, if you remember, they have outer hair cell damage, so their outer hair cells aren't properly transferring sounds to the auditory nerve. And people that have sensorineural hearing loss or outer hair cell damage could have areas in their cochlea of normal hearing and areas of abnormal hearing. So that's why these patients will complain that they hear speech, but they can't understand it because some of the speech is being processed and some isn't. So that's why we do speech audiometry. It's again to determine someone's difficulty in understanding speech. And we're talking receptive speech, so speech that people hear, not expressive speech, which is speech that people speak. So speech audiometry helps the audiologist answer questions regarding a patient's degree of disability in speech communication caused by the hearing loss, the patient's most comfortable and uncomfortable listening levels, their range of comfortable listening, and their ability to recognize and discriminate speech sounds. So the test environment is similar to the environment where we tested the pure tones. The patient will just stay in their seat and you will basically push a button on the audiometer and you'll switch from pure tones to speech. So again, there'll be like a 2-room suite. There's an audiologist in one room with the equipment, the audiometer, and then there's the patient in the opposite room with like a window to look through. But again, they're in a sound isolated chamber. You're controlling for the environment to make it as quiet as possible. To use speech testing, there are 2 ways to do it. It can be done with recorded materials or it can be done with live materials. So recorded materials on a CD where they're just word lists on the CD. These CDs are standardized. You don't have to worry about your accent. You don't have to worry about whether or not the person, if there's a mispronunciation and the person doesn't hear it correctly. With the recorded material, it's standardized. So it's a smart thing to use recorded material. However, some audiologists prefer to use their voice, their live voice. And an advantage of the live voice is that it provides more flexibility and it's faster, and time is money. And sometimes you could have patients backed up in your waiting room and you don't want to waste time on a slower recorded material, even though it might be a better test. You might be more anxious to get through the testing and therefore use your live voice. So the patient, they have to know their role in the testing, just like they had to know their role with the pure tone testing. And the patients must understand the words that they're being tested on. Speech testing is not a test of vocabulary. I absolutely do not care if my patient understands the words that I'm speaking. It's not a test of vocabulary. I am just testing their ability to hear and process my speech. Patient responses can be obtained orally, written, or through the identification of pictures and objects. For example, I could say to my patient, say the word yes, and the patient is required to respond yes. Or I could go write the word yes, and the patient writes down the word yes. Or for children that might not have the best expressive language, or for older adults who maybe have lost their ability to speak or have had strokes, I can have them point to a picture. For example, I would say, point to the picture of the bird, and there would be a test with a few different pictures on it, and the patient would be asked to point to a picture instead of expressing it orally or written. So to remember, speech testing, we're testing a person's ability to receptively process speech. Word lists are used. Recorded word lists can be used, or the audiologist's live voice can be used. The patient is going to be asked to signal that they heard the word. So, if you ask the patient to say the word, that's pretty much the most standard, and also it's the quickest. So if I go say the word baseball, the patient says baseball. Say the word hot dog, hot dog. There's a speed to that, which is an advantage, as with the rapport. Now, a disadvantage of the patient responding through spoken language is that there might be misinterpretations. If the patient is not a native English speaker and you have trouble understanding their accents, you might incorrectly mark them wrong, or some incorrect responses might be scored as correct, where you wouldn't get that if you had the patient writing the response down. Okay? Written responses are slower, but they are scored upon completion. You have to be concerned, in addition to being slower, you have to worry about the person's handwriting, whether or not you can read their responses and their spelling. But written responses eliminate errors caused by misinterpretation of the patient's speech and provide a recorded record of the responses. Okay? We also have pictures. So pictures are, like I said, they're good for young children, and so children that might not be great with expressive language, or they might be nervous or uncomfortable, or very young children, they're asked to respond to a picture that matches the stimulus word that the audiologist spoke. This is also used with adults that might have some special needs. Okay, so let's just review what we said so far. So remember, speech audiometry, it's a standard part of the audiological test battery. It happens after pure tone audiometry. We're interested in finding out a person's degree of disability in regards to receptive language. It's performed in a very similar environment as the pure tone audiometry, and the patient doesn't even move. You just push a different button on your audiometer to switch from pure tones to voice or recorded material. Recorded material has the advantage in that it's standardized. You don't have to worry about the audiologist's accent, but it's a bit slower. Live voice, you can move a lot faster, but you have to worry about whether or not the patient can clearly understand you. Now, the patient is going to be asked to write responses, to speak responses, or to point to pictures. Each has their own advantage. With spoken language, again, it's the fastest. You can develop a rapport with the patient, but you have to worry about incorrectly marking your patient wrong for a word that they pronounced in a way that you weren't expecting. There's also written responses, but again, this really slows things down. Picture responses are great for children or for adults that don't have the ability to speak the responses. Now, there are still false false responses to consider, but false positives are theoretically impossible. Basically, if the audiologist isn't saying a word, then there's no reason for the patient to say a word. It would be odd, right? So if we're just both sitting there quietly and I'm at my audiometer and the patient is across from me, and the patient blurts out, ball, that would be a false positive, but that's not going to happen because I didn't say anything. I didn't say the word ball or say the word hot dog. False negatives could happen. False negatives are when your voice is at a level that the patient should be able to hear and respond, and the patient is not responding. If you suspect false negatives, the best thing to do is to re-instruct the patient and make sure that they understand their roles in the test. With children, you're always going to be testing with 2 audiologists, and we'll speak about this at a later chapter. You have to explain to them what is expected and, be friendly and outgoing and be able to develop a rapport with your children and adults and whoever you're testing. On a side note, when you're reading these word lists to the patients, you want to hold like a piece of paper in front of your face because just like with the pure tone audiometry, any movement or hand gestures might, give it away that you're sending a sound in. People are very good at lip reading, and you don't want anyone lip reading. You don't want to get that sort of, you don't want them to have that advantage in this test when you're just testing for their ability to hear speech. So you should hold a piece of paper up in front of your face, and this prevents the lip reading. Okay, so the first test that we're going to perform is speech threshold testing. And this is similar to what we did with pure tone testing, but now we're using speech stimuli. Okay. So there are 2 ways to do it. There's speech detection threshold, and then there's speech recognition threshold. Speech detection threshold is the lowest level in decibels at which a subject can barely detect the presence of speech and identify it as speech. It also is sometimes called the speech awareness threshold, or with children, the music awareness threshold. Now, the speech detection threshold doesn't imply that speech is understood, just that it was detected. To perform speech detection threshold, you're going to read like cold running speech. So maybe you're reading a passage from a book, and you're going to start at a level that is definitely below the person's threshold. So you would look to their audiogram, you would look to their pure tone average, and you would see what the pure tone average was, and then go below that. And the audiologist is just going to start reading the passage, or if it's a standardized CD, the CD will just start reading a passage. And so it's this cold running, monotonous speech. So very, very few like intonation curves, just, smooth speech. And sorry, what's going to happen is the audiologist is going to slowly raise the volume of his or her voice from, say, 0 decibels to 5 decibels to 10 decibels until the patient indicates that they hear speech. Now, it's not that they understand what's being heard, just that they detect that speech is in the environment. Okay, so before we move on to speech recognition threshold, I want you to understand the speech detection threshold. It's also can be called the speech awareness threshold or the music awareness threshold. So let's say with young infants, you could test a music awareness threshold. Well, not super young infants, let's say around 6 months and above. The audiologist would put on music, a song, like a children's song that the child would be interested in. And the audiologist would start it at a very low level, and she would slowly raise the dial from 0 to 5 to 10. The point where the child looks up and wonders, what's that? Where's that coming from? That's their music awareness threshold. Same thing as the speech detection threshold. It doesn't imply that any person was able to recognize the full words, just that they detected speech. So it's easier to detect that speech is in an environment than to recognize the word and repeat it back. So after speech detection threshold, we perform the speech recognition threshold. And the speech recognition threshold is the lowest level that a person recognizes and repeats speech back to the audiologist. So speech recognition threshold, that level is going to be higher than the speech detection threshold. For example, a normal hearing person would have a speech detection threshold around 0 or 5, and a speech recognition threshold a little bit louder at 10 or 15 dB, because it's harder to recognize speech than it is to detect that speech was present. And you perform the speech recognition threshold in the way you would perform pure tone audiometry. Remember when you were looking for the threshold search was down 10, up 5, down 10, up 5, until you get about a 50% of the words are repeated back correctly. And then that's their speech recognition threshold. Words that are used to test the speech recognition threshold are called Spondaic or Spondaic words. They're bisyllabic words with equal stress and equal effort on both sides. So, for example, ice cream, hot dog, railroad, baseball, iceberg, airplane. Those are all bisyllabic words, equal stress on both parts. So what the audiologist is going to do is she's going to go say the word railroad, say the word airplane, say the word hot dog. And notice these are all words that are relatively simple, because again, we're not testing someone's vocabulary. I'm testing their ability to hear and process speech. So to perform the speech recognition threshold testing, the first thing you do is you familiarize the patient with the words prior to the beginning of the test. And you do this at a level that is comfortable for the patient. So if the patient's threshold is at 10, 50 decibels is probably a comfortable level for them. And you read to them all the words that you're going to be testing them on. Okay? So after we know that they can recognize the words, we start our threshold search. And our threshold search starts with say the word baseball. And then the person is asked to repeat the word baseball. So we would start at a level of 30 decibels. You present your Spondaic word. If the person repeats the word correctly, you can go down 10 decibels. If they don't repeat the word, if they can't hear the word, if they say, I'm sorry I missed that, or I don't understand, which could be common, you jump up to 50 automatically, and you keep going up in 10 dB till you get a response. Once you get a response, you start your threshold search. Down 10, up 5, down 10, up 5, until you get about a 3 correct response rate. Your speech recognition threshold should correspond to your pure tone average. Okay, so going back over here, yes, remember I said it's easier to detect speech than it is to recognize speech. Therefore, your recognition threshold is always going to be a bit higher than your speech detection threshold. Your speech recognition threshold should correspond with your pure tone average. Remember from the last chapter, the pure tone average is the average of the thresholds collected at 500, 1,000, and 2,000, those speech frequencies. So you calculate the average for the right ear, you calculate the average for the left ear, and they should correspond with your SRT by about 5 decibels. And that's part of the cross-check principle. That's one of the reasons that I really like audiology, is because there are a number of tests and they all should sort of fall in place together, and you put together a puzzle. The puzzle comes together, based on these tests. So this is one of those tests where we compare the pure tone average to the speech recognition threshold. In some cases, they might be different if there's like an audiogram that really drops off in the high frequencies. If a person has a really bad high frequency hearing loss, then they might not correspond, but in general, the speech recognition threshold and the pure tone average should correspond. Cross-hearing, just like it happened with pure tone audiometry, might happen with the speech testing. With cross-hearing, remember, it's when like a good ear helps out a bad ear. So what you do for that is you put noise in one ear to distract it so that it can't help the other ear. And you would put in like a broadband noise, a white noise that has energy at all frequencies. If the noise has energy at all frequencies, it can mask any other words that are coming around and kind of knock out one ear so that the other ear can be tested. Remember, it's like when you go to get your eye exams and they make you cover your left eye while you test your right eye and whatnot. So we do also do masking for speech testing to knock out one ear so that it doesn't help the other ear.